and welcome to our first all virtual Freedom School. This is new, but we're glad to have you here. And I just wanted to introduce Julie Sheetz-Willard from Campus Ministry. And her session is Faithfully Nonviolent, Hindu, Buddhist, and Jewish Voices in the American Civil Rights Movement. And we need to tell you this is being recorded, so just to let you know that. Take it away, Julie.
All right. Thank you, Katie.
Sure.
So I'm going to kind of toggle back and forth with sharing my screen. Sorry. So the work that I do here at Villanova in campus ministry, it focuses on interfaith engagement and helping to support students of different faith backgrounds who are part of our Villanova community. And I have been fascinated for quite a while with the way in which the American Civil Rights Movement drew on diverse religious traditions and figures for some of its inspiration and direction. So historian and Martin Luther King biographer Taylor Branch once said that the civil rights movement fused the political promise of equal votes with the spiritual doctrine of equal souls. Founded on a belief in the dignity of all women and men as children of a loving God, the movement sought justice and equity for people of all races, cultural backgrounds, and religious faiths. And so today I want to take a closer look at the spiritual and moral dimension of the movement and the diverse voices that help to shape it. And I'm going to do that really through telling the story of King's interaction with three key figures. So it looked, we asked as folks were coming on who heard the keynote address last night, and it looked like many of you do. Amazing presentation of kind of the radical impulse of King's work. And if you stayed on to the end, I think it was maybe the last question that Dr. Taylor was asked was about the significance of King's faith on his work and the movement. And she responded that King embraced, clearly, obviously was a Christian, a Baptist minister, but that he embraced, in her words, a particular radical interpretation of Christianity, which I think is quite accurate. And she identified it. She said an interpretation that focused on a Jesus who believed that the meek would inherit the earth, which is a quote from the Gospel of Matthew. So King was not only a Baptist minister, he was also a deeply sophisticated theologian and scholar. He started college at the age of 15, and he completed his PhD in systematic theology by the time he was 26. The faith that he drew on in his writing, his preaching, his speeches, and the faith that fueled his activism was richly informed by his Christian faith, but also that scholarship. And in a way that I think was pretty remarkable for the middle of the 20th century, his faith was open to and profoundly informed by the teachings and witness of people of other faiths. And so our session today will focus on that engagement with three key figures whose own nonviolent activism arose out of other religious traditions. So we'll be talking about Mahatma Gandhi, a Hindu, Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was Jewish, and Thich Nhat Hanh, Buddhist monk, Vietnamese Buddhist monk. Get to the in 2018, the late Georgia Congressman John Lewis, who was then in his 9th term in Congress, was part of a bipartisan congressional pilgrimage to Memphis, Birmingham, Montgomery, and Selma, visiting the iconic sites of the civil rights movement and marking the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. As we all know at this point, Lewis's own engagement with the civil rights movement began when he was a student, participating in lunch counter sit-ins and as a freedom rider, and then as the leader of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. By 1963, at the age of only 23, Lewis was recognized as one of the big 6 leaders of the movement, along with King and others. And 2 years later, he led 600 marchers across the Edmund Pettus Bridge on what became known as Bloody Sunday. Despite more than 40 arrests, physical attacks, and serious injuries, John Lewis remained a devoted advocate of the perspective of nonviolence. And he continued in the struggle for racial and economic justice throughout his lifetime. So pictured with him from this 2018 trip there on the Edmund Pettus Bridge was one of the newest members of Congress at that time, a first-term congressman from California named Ro Khanna. Khanna is an Indian American, and he is the grandson of someone named Amarnath Vidyalankar, who was an Indian freedom fighter who spent the early 1940s in jail with Mahatma Gandhi, as he was engaged with Gandhi in the Indian independence movement. So from this 2018 trip, Lewis and Khanna wrote an article about their journey and the way in which it reflected the intertwined nonviolent activism of the Hindu Gandhi and the Christian King. For while King was deeply rooted in the biblical and theological foundations of his Baptist faith, he found in the approach of Gandhi in his struggle to liberate India from British rule a kind of path to embody the love ethic at the heart of that Christian faith. But before we go further, let's take a moment to think about the civil rights movement, the process of nonviolent resistance that was expressed in these mass organizations that Dr. Taylor talked about last night, mobilizing people to engage in protest through lunch counter sit-ins, through the Montgomery bus boycott and the Memphis sanitation workers strikes. So the deployment of economic pressure, but also just the mass force of human engagement in this process of nonviolence. So I think we're a small enough group, and I'm gonna stop the share for a moment so that we can see each other. Just kind of let's talk and think together for a moment. Sort of what were the key elements of that philosophy of nonviolence? You can either write something in the chat or jump right in with just at the most basic level as you think about the images you've seen and the history you know. What were sort of the key ingredients of nonviolent resistance? It's always hard to be the first person to talk. Tom, thank you.
For my one class, we had to read the Birmingham jail letters.
Mm-hmm.
And based upon those letters, I'm pretty sure it said like you had to first, be aware of the facts and everything. You had to be self-aware of, just the stuff that's set in concrete, And then once you have those facts, you go to negotiate, try to compromise. And then afterwards, you take direct action in a way that, obviously doesn't provoke anything violent.
Great. Yeah, so you just laid out a lot right there. Thanks, Tom. So we think of the visual of the nonviolent action, but the fact is that there's a whole process that precedes that. That's very strategic, and depends very much on research and information and knowing the kind of vulnerabilities of the power structures that you're trying to challenge. So nonviolent resistance is very strategic. What else can we say about it?
Kind of going off of that, I feel like the segregation was kind of like institutionalized. So when they were doing like nonviolent acts, it kind of prevented them, the leaders of, say, the ones that were segregating, it prevented them from really being in charge. And I guess they didn't necessarily like that. So they wanted to take like the control back. So they would do anything to kind of get back in charge.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's great, Sarah. So part of what happens in the process of nonviolent resistance is that it sort of unmasks the power structure, right? So the people who attacked those who were marching or protesting were kind of drawn out to reveal the sort of underlying structures of oppression and discrimination. So so there's something that in it that evokes a kind of revealing of exactly what's going on. What about the action itself? As you think about, I want to get just really basic. So what is required, or what is sort of central to this kind of social action?
I think maybe like get a lot of people involved, get people really become aware of the social change that need to be happen, to like use this massive awareness and like campaign instead of the violence.
Yes, thanks you. Yeah, so it depends on this kind of massive people power, right? So it depends on educating and community building and creating networks of commitment and engagement. So when we, I don't know if any of you were here when Diane Nash, one of the kind of early student leaders of the civil rights movement, spoke here at Villanova a few years ago, and she talked about the meetings that would happen endlessly, and it would be a matter of one person inviting another person, and the kind of basic groundwork that was laid to create these mass movements. And in terms of the actual practice, the sort of core commitments were that one could not engage in harm to others, that there was no act of retaliation, and I think this is sometimes misunderstood about about nonviolent resistance, but that it is a profoundly active rather than a passive stance. So it's not simply letting people do whatever they will to you and simply absorbing that, but it is a kind of moral courage to allow that harm as a strategic action and initiative. And it's so for King, this was deeply grounded in his own Christian faith. From the most basic kind of affirmation of humanity being created in the image of God, and so the regard that every human being had that human dignity that came from creation, and that applied both to those who were engaged in the resistance and to those who were oppressing them. So the nonviolence came out of this deep respect for human dignity. For King, also the kind of moral force of commitment to the struggle was deeply grounded in the words of the Hebrew prophets, who kind of made this fundamental connection between faithfulness to God and living out just relationships in human community. And so we see in the prophets, in Amos and Hosea and Isaiah, these repeated calls to the people of Israel who are oppressing those on the margins, or who are neglecting those who are most vulnerable. The prophets repeatedly kind of bring God's message of the requirement for justice in society as a mark of faithfulness to God. King also clearly draws on the example of Jesus, who in his life and ministry consistently extends grace and healing and empowerment to the most vulnerable, to women, to people who are sick, to people who are poor, and experiencing suffering in this world. Jesus is in particular concerned for them and expressing God's concern for them. And then in particular, I think King was, I'm going to share my screen again if I can get to the button, was impacted by the passage that we refer to in the Gospel of Matthew as the Sermon on the Mount. So I wonder if someone would want to read this for us. This is the beginning of Matthew 5, verses that are familiar to many and often referred to as the Beatitudes. Would someone be willing to read that for us?
I can. I might just I'm blind, so.
Thanks, Caroline.
When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up to the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, of theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they are persecuted for the prophets who were before you.
Great. Thanks, Caroline. So here we see this kind of profound reversal of the normal kind of understandings of power and privilege, the blessing of those who are on the margins of the power structure. And further on, so this what we refer to as the Sermon on the Mount is kind of includes chapters 5 through 7 of Matthew. And a little further on in that section, we have this very kind of direct set of passages where Jesus is kind of referring back to the teachings of his Jewish listeners and offering not a rejection of those teachings, but a more profound deepening and sort of extreme challenge. And here we get this sort of seed of nonviolent resistance. You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist an evildoer, but if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So we hear in this this kind of profound love ethic that challenges and really turns on its head the usual kinds of interactions. And it's this spiritual teaching that really comes to infuse King's work, and the specific vision of bringing a personal ethic of nonviolent retaliation and moral witness to the work of social change. But
so,
King, I'm sorry.
Can I say something about the text?
Yes.
So I'm in a nonviolence class right now, and we read an author who interpret this text differently. So like, for example, when it was saying like, when someone wants your coat, give your cloak as well. Like the scholar interpreted as because back in Romans time, like being naked is a shame on the people who make the other person naked. So if you give not only your coat, but your cloak, and then it's a sort of nonviolent resistance. You're showing that it's not to say put a shame on the other person, but to make the other person realize what they did was like essentially very wrong. And when they say go another mile, like you go the 2nd mile, was because also back in the cultural context of that time, the 2nd mile was being seen as like it was unlawful. Like someone could force you to go 1 mile, but go another mile is like sort of unlawful. So that's why when you go 2nd mile, you put it's another way of nonviolent resistance to express your disagreement, but without being violent.
Thank you, Xiu. That's wonderful. And yes, the late New Testament scholar Walter Wink kind of was the first one to surface this sort of understanding of Jesus' teaching as a as a kind of almost a kind of coded resistance to the domination system, as Wink would talk about it. The other one was, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, so you would, in that culture, you would, if you were a superior striking an inferior, you would strike them with the back of your hand, right? But if you were equals and you were striking someone, you would strike them with your palm. So to say turn the other cheek would force the person to strike you as an equal rather than as a subordinate. Thank you, Shio. I had that in my notes and I thought, well, maybe I better keep moving, but that's really crucial. Thank you so much for surfacing that. Better keep moving here. So King, early in his life becomes very aware of the sort of intertwined oppression of racial and economic injustice. And already by the time he's in college, he's thinking about, how do we address this issue? How do we make social change? And by the time he's in seminary, he began what he described in one of his books as a serious intellectual quest for a method to eliminate social evil. He studied the social gospel movement of the early 20th century, studied Marxism and communism and pacifism, but kind of remained unsatisfied. And then something happened, which he describes in his book, Stride Toward Freedom. He says, one Sunday afternoon, I traveled to Philadelphia to hear a sermon by Dr. Mordecai Johnson, president of Howard University. Dr. Johnson had just returned from a trip to India, and to my great interest, he spoke of the life and teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. His message was so profound and electrifying that I left the meeting and bought a half dozen books on Gandhi's life and works. Like most people, I had heard of Gandhi, but I had never studied him seriously. As I read, I became deeply fascinated by his campaigns of nonviolent resistance. I was particularly moved by the Salt March to the Sea and his numerous fasts. The whole concept of satyagraha, satya which means truth, a truth which equals love, and graha is force. So satyagraha, this sort of underlying theme of Gandhi's philosophy means this truth force or love force. And King says, as I delved deeper into the philosophy of Gandhi, my skepticism concerning the power of love gradually diminished, and I came to see for the first time its potency in the area of social reform. Prior to reading Gandhi, I had about concluded that the ethics of Jesus were only effective in individual relationships. But Gandhi was probably the first person in history to lift the love ethic of Jesus above mere interaction between individuals to a powerful and effective social force on a large scale. So here we have Gandhi, a lifelong Hindu, who was given a Christian Bible when he was in England studying law, and connected himself deeply with the sermon, with the message from the Sermon on the Mount. And then later, when Gandhi is in South Africa and begins to develop his own philosophy of nonviolent resistance, which is informed, as King's was, by in part by reading Thoreau, although for Gandhi that was kind of integrated into a larger philosophy. And throughout his lifetime, Gandhi kind of holds together this message of Jesus alongside his own Hindu tradition. So reading the Sermon on the Mount along with the Bhagavad Gita, which a quote like this from that Hindu text, and we see the resonances. The quote says, "Who serves both friend and foe with equal love, not buoyed up by praise nor cast down by blame, alike in heat and cold, pleasure and pain, free from selfish attachment and self-will, ever full in harmony, everywhere, firm in faith. Such a one is dear to me." So in a similar way, the blessings expressed in the Beatitude and this sense of the person grounded in love in the Hindu faith. Oops. Oh, I missed one. Okay. So we find a Hindu who has been influenced by the message of Jesus provides a methodology for the Christian king to deploy the love ethic of Jesus in the struggle for racial and economic justice. And on that tour back in 2018, while visiting King's home, John Lewis and Ro Khanna learned that King always carried two books with him when he traveled, the Bible and the Gandhi Reader. So that's one of the interfaith connections. And then we have another connection. So in 1965, when King led the march from Selma to Montgomery, one of the people with whom he marched arm in arm was this man, Abraham Joshua Heschel. Heschel was a Hasidic rabbi and professor of religion at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, who had fled his native Poland to escape the Holocaust. He understood that racism and religious prejudice were two sides of the same destructive coin, and believed that the teachings of the Hebrew prophets were a call to action for social justice in response to both. So Heschel and King meet at a conference in 1963 on religion and race, and they immediately make this powerful connection out of their own experiences of oppression and struggle. In the speech at that conference, King already affirms this kind of interfaith nature of the civil rights struggle, when he says the churches and synagogues have an opportunity and a duty to lift up their voices like a trumpet and declare unto the people the immorality of segregation. We affirm that every human life is a reflex of divinity, and every act of injustice mars and defaces the image of God in man. The undergirding philosophy of segregation is diametrically opposed to the undergirding philosophy of our Judeo-Christian heritage, and all the dialectics of the logicians cannot make them lie down together. And then Heschel speaks directly after King at this conference and links the struggle for racial justice to the liberation of the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt. And Heschel says this: at the first conference on religion and race, the main participants were Pharaoh and Moses. The outcome of that summit meeting has not come to an end. Pharaoh is not yet ready to capitulate. The Exodus began, but it is far from having been completed. In fact, it was easier for the children of Israel to cross the Red Sea than for a Negro to cross certain university campuses. So Heschel and King are both these profoundly trained theologians who remain close colleagues until King's death. In fact, just like a week before King's assassination, he was in the Catskills at a birthday celebration for Heschel. So Heschel, the Jewish scholar, and King, the Christian activist, shared a powerful sense of the role of the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, and they regarded one another as embodying that prophetic role. Heschel's perhaps most famous work was a serious and profound volume on the Hebrew prophets, which was a source of inspiration to King. And Heschel also reports that as he was completing that volume, he was watching King's activism and being inspired and seeing the connections. Heschel says, where in America today do we hear a voice like the prophets of Israel? Martin Luther King is a sign that God has not forsaken the United States. God has sent him to us. His presence is the hope of America. His mission is sacred. As Heschel saw a profound connection between the silence of the German people in the face of the rise of Hitler and the struggle to awaken white America to the evils of racism, King linked the anti-racism of the civil rights movement to the countering of anti-Semitism and religious hatred of any kind. And we see even today how deeply intertwined racial injustice and anti-Semitism is. We don't need to think any further than January 6th and the images on the shirts of the rioters, or the march a few years ago in Charlottesville. Following the march from Selma to Montgomery, Heschel famously said, "I felt my legs were praying." It was a reference to a practice that was part of traditional Hasidic Jewish piety, the practice of walking with the rabbi. Hasidism sought to endow all physical acts with the presence of the soul. And so to walk with a rabbi meant to experience the holy in everyday actions, to feel the divine radiance emanating from him, and to recognize that walking too can be directed to heaven as a prayer. So again, a second interfaith encounter that both enriches and broadens the scope of the civil rights movement, but also impacts other work against racial and religious discrimination. And then a third encounter. So we know that toward in the few years before his death, Martin Luther King made the controversial decision to speak out against the Vietnam War. And this was there were many who counseled him against this as a diluting of his message or a complicating of the work that he was meant to do. But he felt compelled to do this as he kind of recognized the interconnection of oppressions and the reality of shared struggles for justice. And his decision was, at least in part, influenced by yet another interfaith encounter with the Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh. Now, many of us know Thich Nhat Hanh, who is now quite elderly, as one who has written and taught extensively about the power of mindfulness to transform our ability to act for good and for justice in the world. But at the time that he encountered King, he was a very young monk in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And with his fellow monks, Thich Nhat Hanh engaged in a form of nonviolent protest, calling for reconciliation between North and South. Of course, this call was seen as a threat, and he and others were eventually exiled from Vietnam. He was not allowed to return throughout the whole course of the war and following. And he eventually moved to France and started a monastic community called Plum Village, from where he brings these teachings of mindfulness. but at the time of his initial exile, he spent time in the US where he encountered King. And so there's the picture. And rather than telling you about that encounter, I want to share it with you in Thich Nhat Hanh's own words from an interview that he did with Oprah. I just want to share. Everybody see that okay? Make it bigger.
Wait, I saw your PowerPoint, but I don't see the.
Oh, okay.
Maybe you should create a new share.
Yes, thank you.
No problem.
Thanks, Shu. No matter how many times we do this, we are still learning. All right. Now, do we see it okay? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. But no sound.
Well, shoot.
You have to check the little box when you start to share.
Okay.
Little button at the bottom left-hand side where it says share sound. When you start your share.
Gotcha. Okay, but now we seem to have lost the, sorry. Go through this again.
I don't practice. And then I will dry up.
Can we hear it now?
Did you feel sadness?
Yes.
Did you allow yourself to feel the sadness?
In the first year of my being exiled, I dreamt.
Sorry.
Declared that they wanted to fight until the end. And those of us who try to speak out against the war, to speak about reconciliation between brothers and brothers, they did not want us to raise our voice.
So when you were a man without a country, you made another country, made a home in other countries. And the United States was one of them.
Yes.
How did you meet Martin Luther King?
In June the 1st, 65, I wrote him a letter explaining to him why the monks in Vietnam immolated themselves by fire. I said that it's not a suicide, because in a difficult situation like Vietnam, to make your voice heard is difficult. So sometimes we have to burn ourselves alive in order for our voice to be heard around. So that is out of compassion that you do that. That's the act of love and not of despair. And Jesus Christ died in the same spirit, out of love.
Being hung on the cross.
And exactly 1 year after, June the 1st, 66, I met him in Chicago. And we had that discussion about peace, freedom, and community. And we agreed that without a community, we cannot go very far.
How long was the discussion with him?
45 minutes or so. And after that, there was a press conference, and he came out very strongly against the war in Vietnam.
Do you think that that was a result of your conversation with him?
I believe so. And after that, we continue our work. And the last time I met him was in Geneva during a peace conference called Pacem in Terris.
There's an interesting story from that I heard, that you were running late. Can you tell me that story?
Martin Luther King invited me up for breakfast talk over these issues again. And I was caught in a press conference downstairs. I came late. He kept the breakfast warm for me. And during the conversation, I was able to tell him that the people in Vietnam call him a bodhisattva, enlightened being, because of what he was doing for his people, his country, for the world.
And the fact that he was doing it non-violently.
Yes, that is the work of a bodhisattva, of a Buddha, of an enlightened person, always with the compassion and non-violence.
So again, we see the meeting of these deeply held religious principles and values that become a bridge across religious difference. So these three stories, and there are others, document the very particular relationships of King to profoundly influential figures of diverse faiths, and the way that those influenced his thinking, his leadership, and his activism. But they also reflect a willingness, not only in King, but in the civil rights movement more broadly, to draw inspiration from the deep wells of human thought and religious insight, to build coalitions that recognize the intersection of oppressions and the shared legacy of injustice, and to find common cause in the creative and courageous work of nonviolence. And we see that work still today, embodied in many places, even in our own neighborhood, in the work of organizations like the organization Power, that brings together Christians, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, people of all faith, to address social issues in the city of Philadelphia and in the wider region. And I know that some of us here have been involved in that movement. So from this, very rich legacy from the time of the civil rights movement, we see the possibility of interfaith alliances that enable a kind of broadening of the base of the work for social justice, that make possible the drawing on a rich diversity of spiritual and moral insights and wisdom, and that enable people to meet on the common ground of the pursuit of human dignity. So I just want to open it up for any comments or questions, things that were new insights, or anything that you would like to respond to in that on this topic. How many folks knew of these different figures and their impact on King? Somewhat, yeah. Okay, so some new information to connect with the story of the civil rights movement. One other interesting piece, particularly related to the last story, Thich Nhat Hanh's story. Martin Luther King actually nominated Thich Nhat Hanh for a Nobel Peace Prize. So the influence with all of these figures, it's I think most fascinating to see how the influence was truly mutual, and that that both traditions, both perspectives, and the work of both figures in each case was enriched and deepened and expanded by their by their engagement with one another. And I think this is, for me and the work that I do around interfaith engagement, I think this is one of the really inspiring possibilities, that there is so much, there is so much richness in our in the faith traditions that ground us, and that become a kind of motivating force for work in the world. And when we can learn from one another about the particular perspectives on the motivation for that work, I think it only becomes enriched and strengthened. So thank you very much for being here. And for your attention. And I hope that I hope this gives you a little something to ruminate on as you continue to think about the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. And thanks to Katie for hosting us here today.
Thanks, Julie.
Thanks. That's beautiful.
It was
Thank
really
you.
lovely, Julie. Thank
Thank
you.
you,
Great to
Julie.
see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very
Bye.
good.
Have a good day.
You too. Take care.
Stay safe.